Dari? Whiskey? Ah, Dari, you could never unlock my secret. Oh no, suddenly. Hello, Libby! Let's begin. Indeed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. My name is Brian, and this is the Fireside Chat. And on today's episode of the Fireside Chat, I am joined by a very special guest who wishes to remain anonymous, so we're just going to call him MRA Title IX, or maybe just Title IX, I don't know. We'll figure it out. But welcome to the show, MRA Title IX. How are you today?
I am doing great, thank you.
All right.
Glad to be here and talk some things Title IX that I think aren't being covered in the media and need to be.
Yes, and you actually mentioned some things that are kind of interesting before we got started. So normally, when Title IX comes up, it's usually in the context of, you know, like the kangaroo courts and allegations and things like that. But you have you've been trying to like get people to see that it actually causes more problems outside of just that sort of like narrow, I guess, scope of the issues with Title IX. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, I think it is. You know, the area outside of sexual harassment doesn't get a lot of attention, and the issues inside of that lead to a culture that manifests in a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the sexual harassment umbrella. So like if we want to fix some of the problems with Title IX, we need to look at it more holistically than we are.
And we're gonna come back to that. I'd like to explore that. What for people who might not know, and so we have a good number of people who, you know, they're younger. Maybe they're not aware of Title IX, but also they're not Americans. So maybe they're, you know, just wondering what this is. Could you give everyone here like a quick rundown of what Title IX is, and then like maybe some of the things that, you know, have sort of created opportunities for it to be exploited, like the Dear Colleague letter, for example?
Yeah. Um, So Title IX is a federal civil rights law that bars discrimination based on sex in any educational program that receives federal financial assistance. And those last little three words there, federal financial assistance, is it's not necessarily just money. You really need to interpret that as broadly as possible, and that's how the courts do it as well. And so, you know, if you're running a wood chopping class on like a federal state park grounds, you know, that triggers Title IX. If you took PPP loans from the Small Business Administration and you use those for, say, training waiters at your restaurants, that would trigger Title IX. And in the case of educational institutions, when your primary purpose is education, Title IX will just extend to the entire organization itself. So even if they don't end up using federal funds in some little small part of the school, Title IX would still be implicated in how they conduct those operations.
Okay.
And so you'll hear me reference OCR throughout this. Well, there's a couple different OCRs, and I'll be talking about the Department of Education's OCR, and they're responsible for enforcing these rules within our educational system. So a student, you know, that gets discriminated against can write a complaint to OCR and, you know, potentially seek relief that way rather than going to the courts and having to spend all this money. And so schools really looked at OCR and the cases that they're ruling on as a bellwether for whether or not their programs are compliant. So my activism by writing complaints to OCR helps set that precedent and send that message to other schools that these programs are not acceptable and that they need to end them or open them up to everybody.
I see. And what is OCRs? What does it stand for?
It's the Office of Civil Rights.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And are they pretty receptive to what? I mean, I didn't mean to make anybody laugh, but
Yeah,
like, are they pretty easy to work with, or?
no, not at all. It's an absolute nightmare. Working with them is that's an interesting way of phrasing it. I kind of work against them in a lot of regards.
Hmm.
They have a lot of BS dismissals, and weird rulings that they issue out where basically the main goal of OCR in handling a lot of my cases is not to end the discriminatory practice. Um, it is to not send the message to other schools that they need to end them. So
Yeah.
like even if there's a clear violation, there's a whole lot of tricks and things that they use to avoid making an actual finding of a violation, and then that ends up meaning that other schools don't get the message they need to end this. It's sort of like a tacit green light that other schools can keep doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so what got you interested? Like, do you have like a story, like a personal story that, I guess, caused you to be interested in the work that you do regarding Title IX?
Yeah, I'll kind of give the abridged version here. It's a very long story. So I was a graduate student at Texas A&M, and when I looked around the program and the things that they were doing, um, there were a lot of discriminatory programs going on, and it was just a lot to deal with while I was in graduate school. So I kind of kept my head down. And the straw that really broke the camel's back on this was that they sent out an email for a job fair, and this job fair had a limited number of seats. It
Mm-hmm.
was going to be one-on-one meetings with recruiters and workshopping your resume to apply for open positions. And so you had to apply to attend the job fair. And at the bottom of the application, it asked if you were a female graduate student in STEM. And next to the button to click no, it said, please don't apply. We prioritize female graduate students in STEM.
Oh.
Uh, so that was my first Title IX complaint. I wrote that to the school, and they said they ended up finding it was discriminatory, and the resolution for them was reminding the organization of the rules and having them promise not to keep discriminating. And then they turned around and gave them an award for diversity and inclusion. So I was like, this is not right. And
And they
um,
never
I,
they never corrected your situation or anything like that. They didn't. I mean, not that it matters if they just do it for the one guy that complained instead of like making a change, like a systemic change or whatever. But yeah, I mean, did they just get a finger wagging and a slap on the wrist and that was the
yeah,
end of it?
Yeah. So I realized that something wasn't quite right here, and I looked at my rights and stuff under the school policies and realized that they didn't follow their own policies in handling the case, and they didn't give me the rights that I was supposed to have. Like I was supposed to be assigned a case manager, so I could ask them questions about process and what rights and things I had under school policies. Never got one. Never got to talk to them, and so I filed uh, 5 more complaints with the school, and this is all internally at the school, and they ended up handling those cases and even my original case off the books. So they were required to notify their oversight system when they get a complaint like this, and they just didn't. And what this allowed them to do is they could keep those cases in review while they made changes to the programs behind the scenes. And they later dismissed, saying that all of these programs were compliant, but that was after they had made the changes. So what this lets them do is they could avoid disciplining the faculty involved in creating these programs, and they don't create a black mark on their records for having created discriminatory programs. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and for example, one of the directors behind a lot of this at A&M, while she was working there in 2016, published something that where she actually said that Title IX justifies single-sex programming for women within engineering.
Single sex programming.
Yeah,
I
like
mean,
having women-only engineering teams at your school. That
right,
Title
right.
IX apparently justifies this, according to her. And you
Oh,
know,
sure.
she's behind a lot of these programs I complained about, and because the school doesn't find violations, they don't have to look into disciplining this behavior. And those women-only engineering teams continue to persist at the school.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that makes sense. Um, Well, I mean, it does, but like that might I'd have to go into a cultural political conversation to explain it, but it does make sense. So, what are some of the more um like sort of wild examples of the kinds of discriminatory things you saw that are, I guess you could say a byproduct of Title IX. I mean, it's supposed to end discrimination, but it looks like it's really just kind of like protecting it.
Um, for a lot of the things that I complain about, I don't believe that Title IX is being construed to protect them. More that Title IX just isn't being enforced. There's very weird selective interpretations that allow
Oh, I see.
for like selective enforcement of it. A good example was um, so
So
court,
it's written pretty cut and dry, but there are intentional misinterpretations of the law. Is that what you're
yeah,
suggesting?
yeah. A good example was in a case against Rutgers that I filed, and they're still running the program. You can still go look it up and see this language there. It was a hackathon, and they called it an all-female, non-binary hackathon.
Mm-hmm.
And it's face value. That's discriminatory. The school can't limit participation, stuff like this based on this, but
Yeah.
it's a dog whistle. Technically, men could have applied. So what OCR says is that gendered language is allowed to be used in titles and descriptions, but because men could technically apply, it wasn't discriminatory.
Ah,
And
I
really
see.
what they're looking at is a misinterpretation of what the courts have said. When you have a women's studies program, that's legal course content, and you're describing that legal course content. You can study the works of women, of course. But they're extending that to talking about the participants in the program and describing illegal content,
Mm-hmm.
and OCR just won't make rulings on it. They say it's just allowed. So you can have a Women in STEM summer camp for middle school girls, and according to OCR, that is an inclusive program as long as men could technically have applied to it.
Yeah, even though the language seems to suggest that they can't, which is
Right,
like
and
it's essentially telling men, this is not for you, but technically you could join this program, right?
yeah, exactly. And this is the kind of selective enforcement that I'm working against. And
Mm,
even when I get dismissals on these cases, it's still a bit of a win for me in that I can collect examples of them doing this. It's evidencing the problem. When you look at all these universities and all the discriminatory programs they have, the reason they exist is because OCR won't make definitive rulings and they won't impose substantial penalties for those violations. So it's a commit all the violations you want, and then if you get caught, you might have to change the program at
yeah,
worst.
yeah, but they're just going for it regardless. And the
Yeah.
assumption is that no one will really like call them on it. Which I would guess that in most cases they don't. They just kind of like, again, they just apply common sense and or maybe just enough to like justify letting it go. So what are some what are because we talked a little bit before the show. You mentioned that normally when people talk about Title IX, they're talking about like kangaroo courts, false rape allegations, and I guess it's partly because it does appear to be a very serious problem. It's exploitable, and it has ruined the lives of a lot of men, a lot of college men. But you have found that there are other problems with Title IX that people are not talking about that you think need more attention on them. So let's get into that a little
Yeah,
bit.
I touched on it a little bit that I think the number one issue outside of the sexual harassment side of Title IX is that schools effectively have total allowance to say whatever they want in titles and descriptions, even if they're talking about illegal content, and dog whistling, that men shouldn't be applying, things like this, so long as you technically could. And nobody has talked about trying to close that in the Title IX regulations that the titles and descriptions of programs should not be allowed to talk about the protected demographics of the participants when they can't legally discriminate based on them. You can have a men's basketball team because that is legal discrimination and you're talking about the participants. But if you talk about, let's say a men's astronomy class, but technically women can join, that shouldn't be allowed under Title IX. That's
Oh yeah,
but
sure.
yeah, but
But
it's
but
it
how is
technically
that,
is.
out of curiosity? How is that different from a men's basketball team? I mean, like, is it just sort of presumed that because it's an athletic pursuit or something that women wouldn't join, or that they couldn't join a men's football or basketball team, and
Uh,
that makes it different from, say, something that is, like, not athletic but like intellectual, like astrology, like, like physics or something.
Yeah, under Title IX, there's an exception carved out for contact sports that schools can discriminate based on them, and
Oh,
that's where
okay.
you get into reserving roster slots based on the number of men and women that go to your college, and that's the big thing in Title IX with women's sports teams and all that, and making sure that that's equitable.
Right.
But that doesn't apply to the educational pursuits like physics or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. I was just because your examples, one was like a basketball team, but but yeah, no, that is really interesting. And then they seem to so these are the kinds of things that you've been uh filing, I guess you could say, complaints,
Yep.
or and how has that been going? Do you get a lot of resistance?
Oh, it's almost entirely resistance on the part of OCR.
Yeah.
So far, I've actually only scored one resolution, and that was against Strayer University's sexist operation of Hackbright, which we can talk about more later. But regarding all the other ones, it's almost all like BS dismissals and setting up straw man versions of my allegations just so that they can attempt to dismiss them. They'll ignore critical components of the cases. And good example of that was I had filed against a discriminatory scholarship that was explicitly discriminatory. Men literally could not apply to it. You had to be females and listed eligibility criteria. And um, the school was put under investigation. Well, I found this out via FOIA. OCR was aware that the application was closing and the recipient was going to be selected like within a week or two of the investigation being opened. And uh, almost 3 months after that, they allowed the school to retroactively change the application so that it appeared that they were always compliant.
Oh my god.
And then they dismissed the case, but they didn't include this information in the dismissal. They said that they